Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon to our participants in Germany and good morning to our participants here in New York. Welcome to today's Draht zum Rat. The Draht zum Rat, Connecting with the Council, is a podcast series that the FAS New York office hosts about current challenges for Germany's work on the Security Council in 2019 and 2020. My name is Volker Lehmann and I'm a senior policy analyst here at FAS New York's office working on peace and security. And with me today is Richard Gowan. Richard is the UN director of the International Crisis Group here in New York, and many of you might be familiar with him due to his weekly column, Diplomatic Fallout, that Richard wrote for many years until recently for World Politics Review. So what we will do with Richard is a halftime scorecard for Germany on the Council. The first year is over and the second one is about to begin, and we would like to take stock of what Germany could achieve and what is in the cards for next year. How we're going to do this is we're going to have Richard speak with me for some 15 minutes, and then we have 30 minutes for question and answer afterwards, where you're all invited to pose your questions. But first of all, two logistical issues. First, the language. Richard and I, as you notice, will be speaking in English, and we conduct the interview in English. If somebody of you doesn't feel comfortable speaking in English, please pose your questions in German, and we'll do our best to translate. And then second, as you notice, we're using only the audio function of Zoom. What we'll do is we will record the meeting, and if you are using your computer, you have two chances of communicating with us. You can either raise your hand if you push the raise hand button if you want to pose a question, or you have the chat function on your right-hand side. There's also a button for that. If you use the chat function, please go ahead and already start formulating questions if you feel for it, if something comes up during our talk. And those of you who enter our conversation by phone, you will not be forgotten. I will ask you first in the question and answer session to raise your voice and speak to Richard and me directly. And all of you, please mention who you are and what your institutional affiliation is. So that's that. Richard, you should always start on a positive note. What went well for Germany this first year on the Council?
Well, I think if we're going to assess Germany's performance on the Council, we should start by looking at the level of ambition of Germany's diplomacy in New York. And I would say that the German mission has been very ambitious in the Security Council. And this is important because after Berlin won the contest to have a council seat in 2018, I think there was a bit of a debate within the German system about whether to take a fairly cautious approach, whether to avoid major controversies in New York, or whether to be more ambitious and whether to actually really try and have a serious impact and a serious legacy through the Security Council. There were, I think, quite a lot of conservative German officials who thought that it might be risky to be too ambitious, because after experiences such as the Libya crisis in 2011, they know that if you're too brave in the Security Council, things can backfire. What we've actually seen, I think, is Germany be ambitious and in many ways be impactful in New York. We've really seen Ambassador Heusgen and his team pushing, especially during the Council presidency in April, with a very broad package of statements, meetings, and Security Council products around defending the rules-based world order. We've seen Germany pushing international humanitarian law. We've seen it standing up for non-proliferation through the Security Council. And in one case that I'm sure we'll talk more about, Germany made a big push for a resolution on preventing sexual violence in conflict. And I think the rest of the UN membership has really got the message that Germany is very serious about protecting multilateralism, that it is serious about protecting international law. And that resonates positively at a time when the US in particular has been notably negative and notably obstructive in the UN system. So Germany is being ambitious. I think the second thing I would say was a really strong positive is the way that Germany has actually been working with the other European members of the Security Council, Britain, France, Belgium and Poland, to establish a stronger European identity here in New York. And we've seen the 5 countries making a series of joint statements, taking a series of joint positions on everything from Syria to North Korea. And for the first time, the EU, even including for the time being the UK, feels like a semi-coherent actor in the Security Council. And that is in considerable part because Germany has been trying to engineer better European coordination in New York. Finally, and I think perhaps most concretely, German diplomats in the Security Council are very actively involved on some very difficult files, such as Libya and Sudan right now. And what you hear from their counterparts from other countries is that the German team is well respected here. And on Sudan in particular, I think the German mission is playing a very important role, trying to oversee the UN support to the civilian transition in Khartoum. So, it's too early to say that Germany is having a massively successful term on the Security Council. I think we're going to come on to the negatives in a minute. But in terms of activism, in terms of ambition, and in terms of forging a European identity in New York, I think that there are positives.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And indeed, getting to the negatives, what didn't go so well or what went particularly bad in your perspective?
Well, the sad reality is that despite all Germany's best efforts, the Security Council is a mess at the moment. And the UN and the Security Council in particular is really being paralyzed on a lot of crises by tensions between the big powers, most obviously the US, China, and Russia. And Germany has had some pretty serious diplomatic conflicts with all those countries. Russia vetoed a resolution that Germany had worked on with the Belgians and Kuwaitis, calling for a ceasefire in Syria in September. There's been a lot of friction between Germany and China this year, not least because Ambassador Heusgen has been pressing the issue of the Uyghurs in China, and I think that has offended and worried the Chinese mission. And then relations with the US have been difficult. Whereas Germany is pushing an ambitious agenda on multilateralism, the US administration has been really trying to minimize the role of the UN in dealing with a lot of international problems this year. And we saw friction in particular, for example, over Libya, where I think Germany and its European allies would have liked to see the Security Council take quite a strong role in dealing with the upsurge in fighting in Libya this year, but the US refused to cooperate with that. We've seen similar tensions over North Korea and other issues. US-German tensions came to a head over the resolution that we mentioned on sexual violence and conflict, where, as I think everyone knows, the US came very close to vetoing the German text because it contained a brief reference to sexual and reproductive rights that Washington viewed as endorsing abortion. And so you have a situation where Washington and Berlin, whatever their overall strategic relationship right now, keep on running into each other and keep on having problems in the Security Council. And by definition, Washington, as the veto-holding power, tends to come out better from those fights than Germany does. And that is the source, I think, of real frustration to the German team here.
And having said that, I think that since this is not going to go away anytime soon, so what can Germany then realistically expect to achieve the next 12 months when being on the council? Because this geostrategic landscape that you just described will certainly not go away and certainly will also, of course, circumscribe the possibility that Germany has. So what can we realistically hope for?
Well, I think, one very big question for the German team and for Berlin looking at 2020 is about how to approach the question of climate change in the Security Council. During its council campaign and more recently, Germany made it very clear that it wanted to hold a big event and hopefully get some sort of Security Council resolution addressing the links between climate and conflict next year. But it is pretty clear that the current US administration, which is now on track to pull out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2020, is not going to cooperate on any really ambitious climate-related resolution in New York. I think US diplomats have made it clear to German diplomats and to other European representatives that they won't even accept a resolution in the Security Council that contains the words climate change, although they might be more open to a resolution that talked in vaguer terms about the environment. So I think, looking ahead to next year, Germany is trapped between its promises and commitments to make a big effort on climate change in the Security Council and the harsh reality that the US is not going to accept anything very substantive on the issue. So that's going to be a headache going forward. The irony is that if a Democratic candidate wins the 2020 presidential elections, whoever she or he may be, in 2021 or 2022, just after Germany has left the Council, the US might be much more willing to talk about climate. But for the time being, that's not an option. Looking beyond climate, I know there are still a whole range of issues that Berlin wishes it could address more in the UN. One thing that I believe the Chancellor wanted some progress on was focusing on pandemics and global disease issues and international security, but it may be hard to get much progress on that. In concrete terms, I think the one win that Germany really should aim for links to Sudan. And I mentioned that Germany is already playing a significant role in terms of guiding UN diplomacy about how to support the emerging civilian government in Sudan. 2020 is going to be a big year for thinking about how the UN supports this new government in Khartoum. There are ideas for setting up some sort of new UN civilian presence in Khartoum that would be providing governance assistance, that would be looking at things like human rights. I think if Germany can steer a Security Council agreement on assistance to the Sudanese authorities, that may lack the global glamour, if you will, of a success on climate change, but it will be a really concrete and worthwhile contribution to African security. Germany has long been interested in Sudan, not least as a major transit point for migrants coming into Europe. So if it is possible to support the country's stability and keep it on track for civilian governance, that would be a very honourable and very significant legacy from the Security Council term.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. I would like to open the floor now to our participants from abroad in particular, and as I said before, I'd like to give those who call in via phone the first stab at asking their questions. Is there anybody who's on the phone who would like to raise their voice now, please? Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. Is there anybody else out there? Because I have, of course, tons of questions for Richard, but I would first like to give somebody out there a chance to weigh in. Aha, so we have the first question from Ben Christian coming in, and I don't really see where Ben is from, except for that he's probably from Germany, but his question is what Richard thinks about the Alliance for Multilateralism and what steps are needed in 2020.
Okay, so the German and French initiative on the Alliance for Multilateralism was slightly separate to German diplomacy in the Security Council, but the two things obviously were related. One element of Germany's European outreach that I didn't mention in my opening remarks was the fact that France and Germany declared that in March and April this year that they were running a joint presidency of the Security Council. And they used this joint presidency to promote a lot of issues around, for example, international humanitarian law that link quite closely to themes that the Alliance for Multilateralism has been addressing. The actual big kickoff for the Alliance for Multilateralism, though, was outside the Security Council. In September, you had, I think, 60 foreign ministers getting together on the margins of the General Assembly to commit themselves to this alliance. And so it's been something that's been developing in parallel with the council term rather than through the council. What do I actually think of it? I think that it's a good initiative with a great name, but we shouldn't overestimate its importance. What the endorsers of the Alliance for Multilateralism have done is really sign up to a loose network of countries that are supporting a range of initiatives around humanitarian law, around cybersecurity, and various other issues. I think it's a good coordination device. I think that it's a good branding device, if you will, for countries that want to get together to show that they still believe in international cooperation in a period where quite a lot of big powers don't. Will it continue to be a significant motivational force in international affairs? I think that it's important that in 2020, both Paris and Berlin keep on looking for new ways to get supporters of the initiative together. And I think that it would be good if you would have a series of convenings around major events, not only including the General Assembly, but maybe also the African Union Summit, which is early in the year, where countries that support this initiative could get together to talk about their different approaches to defending multilateralism. And I don't think that will change the entire global system, but I do think that that could provide some energy and momentum for promoting cooperative diplomacy.
Very good. Somehow related, but not entirely related, is another question that we are having here from Konstantin Berwald, FAS Berlin, who asks that whether Germany has a chance to revive debates about nuclear disarmament in the Security Council. What could and should the German government do? And then related to that, what can happen, should happen, or what can we expect at the NPT review conference, the review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2020?
So I don't think I don't think I'm able to look into the crystal ball and say what will happen with the NPT review conference. But I think what we can say with some certainty is that disarmament issues and nuclear proliferation issues are rapidly rising up the Security Council agenda. Now, that includes some specific cases. Clearly, the Iran case has been a serious headache in the Security Council next year, and I think there's actually a reasonable chance it's going to be an even more problematic one in 2020. We're seeing, I think, growing splits in the Security Council over how to deal with North Korea, which used to be more of a point of consensus than Iran. But just this week, in fact, the Russians and Chinese have tabled a Security Council resolution calling for dropping some sanctions on North Korea. That's a real challenge to the US, and it's a real challenge to the Europeans as well. Germany, Britain and France have been quite firm and actually quite hawkish in the Security Council this year, talking about the need to keep up pressure on North Korea. Now the Chinese and Russians are going in a different direction. The US is a little confused because it's still trying to keep nuclear talks going with the North Koreans. And my guess is that in 2020, we're going to see quite a lot of big arguments, actually, over how to deal with Pyongyang. Looking beyond the Iran and North Korea cases, we saw Russia initiating a debate on the collapse of the INF Treaty in the Security Council this year, which was largely for public diplomacy purposes. It was largely a provocation to the US, but nonetheless, it was a reminder that the global nuclear architecture is in a lot of trouble. We, I think, can expect to see, sparring between the big powers in the Council over New START next year. I mean, I think nuclear issues are going to be more and more contentious in the Security Council in the rest of Germany's term. Germany, working with, I think, the French and others, made a positive contribution to try and balance all this arguing this year by engineering a statement just endorsing the NPT and trying to sort of put a positive framing on the NPT review conference. I think the vast majority of UN members would like to see the nuclear architecture hold together. I mean, that's largely common sense. But Berlin is probably going to find it very difficult to try and get real consensus between the US, China, and Russia on nuclear issues in the Security Council this year because of the mounting differences we're seeing over missile batteries in the Asia Pacific and so forth.
And let's not forget there are two other nuclear-armed countries who are also part of the P5, namely the UK and France, which in this case I think will never really be as much on the side of Germany as on other issues. But I think for me, this incident that you just mentioned also raises the question, don't we sometimes now aren't we not confronted with the new P3? I mean, here in New York, P3 always used to stand for the Western permanent three members, namely the US, the UK, and France. Nowadays, it seems that oftentimes we have a new P3, and that is China, Russia, and the US, and certainly not for constructive, but certainly for destructive purposes. How can that be overcome? Or, you mentioned it already to some extent, but I think this is the big tectonic shift that we do see in the Security Council going forward.
Yeah, I mean, this year it has sometimes felt like the real split in the Security Council is between the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, who remain broadly committed to international law and multilateral cooperation on the one hand, and then the other three you mentioned, China, Russia, and the US, that all in different ways want to put limits on what the Security Council can do and want to put limits on the growth of international law. Now, I wouldn't treat China, Russia, and the US as a bloc. I think that it's worth saying that on many issues, the US and the Europeans remain broadly on the same page. There are a lot of differences over tactics. For example, on an issue like North Korea, for example, I think the Europeans are much more interested in working through the Security Council than the US is. Nonetheless, strategically, Washington and its allies broadly think that there's still a need for sanctions. Where we are seeing Russia and the US in particular find common ground is to some extent over limiting the role of the UN in places like Libya, where actually both Moscow and Washington would rather support their proxies and don't want the international community getting in the way. And there's also a question of values. I think that on issues like sexual and reproductive rights, the issues that proved so controversial when Germany tabled them in the Security Council in April, there is actually a sort of a common sense amongst the Trump administration, Moscow and Beijing, that the Security Council should not be pushing a very strong liberal agenda and should not be trying to solidify liberal standards in international law. And so when Berlin tabled its resolution concerning sexual violence and conflict, the US, and quite specifically, I think, Vice President Pence's office, were very negative about the reference to reproductive rights. But China and Russia also had a lot of objections, and really they succeeded in blocking the council approving some sort of new international mechanism for accountability for sexual violence. So that was one area where we did see China, Russia, and the US really ganging up, frankly, on Germany and its friends.
Yeah, I'm still looking for more questions from our audience, and I'd like to invite you to indeed pose your questions, but in the meantime, of course, I have tons of questions myself here, and one of them leading the way a little bit from the P5, Richard, towards the elected members, because I think Germany made its mark also because it was able, as you said, to bring together the European countries, but also the non-elected, the non-permanently elected members on the council. Now, this composition of the council, of course, changes every year. And what do you anticipate the council with the new members and some of the European members obviously going out? How do you envision the council and the non-permanent members functioning together next year, given the new composition with some members in, some members out?
I mean, firstly, I don't think we should overestimate how unified the elected members of the Security Council have been. The elected members of the Council, the E10, do cooperate quite closely on some issues in defence of their mutual interests. So on Security Council working methods, for example, there's quite a strong elected consensus about the need to promote transparency and the need to some extent balance the P5. However, when it comes to specific crises, you see that the elected members actually tend to follow their own national interests and worry less about consensus. So, the Europeans, for example, on most issues have got on very well with Peru, who I think have been an excellent member of the council this year. But when it came to talking about Venezuela, actually the Peruvians took a much harder line against President Maduro than the Europeans necessarily liked. Similarly, Kuwait has been an excellent member of the council, but when it comes to talking about Yemen or Syria, the Kuwaitis are trapped by their strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia and have been harder to work with, I think, than some others would have liked. Next year, we're seeing some interesting countries coming into the Security Council. There are at least 2 incoming members who we expect to be pretty close to the Chinese and Russians on a lot of issues. Those are Vietnam and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And actually, there's quite a big block of countries now that do agree with Moscow and Beijing on a lot of issues that come before the Council. South Africa has been relatively close to Russia and China. Indonesia has also proved to be relatively close to them on some issues. And so this is going to make Security Council diplomacy, I think, a little more difficult, because you do now have quite a strong block of countries that, at least instinctively question Western positions. It's not always the case. On Sudan, the African members of the Council, led by South Africa, have actually split quite seriously with the Chinese, because the Africans want the Security Council to do as much as it can to support the Sudanese transition. The Chinese and Russians are very skeptical because they have close ties to the Sudanese military. And so there, the Africans have actually, I think, found themselves much closer to the US and Europeans. Still, overall, I think that next year Council diplomacy is going to be tricky, because you do have not an anti-Western bloc emerging, but at least a Western skeptic bloc emerging within the Council.
And let's not forget also that I think it's fair to say that nowadays, oftentimes, also the challenge to get nine votes to move forward, which is called the procedural vote, at times have proved difficult. So the sheer numbers, and not only the veto, but the sheer numbers to get 9 votes to proceed on an issue might be exactly what you said going forward. I have another question, Richard, because you wrote at the beginning, or looking forward to Germany's tenure on the council, you wrote a piece for FAS New York, In the Hot Seat, what Germany could and should do on the council. So looking back at that piece that you wrote for us back then, I found it interesting that we haven't talked today very much about some of the crises where you had felt Germany may be able to use its leverage, and most prominently maybe Syria and the humanitarian situation in Syria. And related to that, the question, there was kind of a storm in the teacup, a tempest in the teacup in Germany when the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, came up with the proposal that there should be a buffer zone in northern Syria to keep the peace there, maybe even by support from Germany or with even boots on the ground. All this had not been spelled out. But, you know, has this ever mustered here at the UN and on the Council, these proposals?
Not really. I mean, that proposal from Berlin for a buffer zone never got much traction in New York. I think because diplomats here recognized that there was no way that you could negotiate something of that type with the Russians and the US. I mean, if you look back on the paper that I wrote for you in mid-2018, In the Hot Seat, the basic argument there was that Germany should not confine itself just to thematic resolutions on things like sexual violence or climate change. And my argument was that the hallmark of a really significant elected member of the Security Council is actually to engage with specific concrete crises. Now, back then, the concrete crises that I flagged as potential priorities included Syria and Ukraine. I think I have to put my hand up and say that those were maybe bad choices. You know, the Syrian situation, frankly, leaves the Security Council as a whole increasingly exhausted. There's very little desire within the Council to really do much new on Syria because of tensions between the P5. The Ukrainian situation has been largely dormant in UN terms this year, although the recent Normandy format meeting may suggest that there will be more openings for peacemaking in Ukraine in 2020. What I would say, though, is that I do think that Germany has, largely through luck, found a concrete crisis situation to engage with and show its diplomatic sort of weight, which is Sudan, which we've talked about. And so, for me, the precise case is less important than the overall principle, which is that you should use your time in the Security Council to deal with concrete problems, not just to put out big normative statements. The irony being that actually, probably Germany's nastiest diplomatic experience was exactly when it put out a normative statement on reproductive health.
Yeah, the irony of unintended consequences. We have another question here coming in from Antonia Röhm with the Robert Bosch Stiftung, and she asks, how does the membership of Germany in the Security Council change its image in international relations? Does it empower German foreign policy as such, or are there other UN or international bodies that are more important to get engaged for having an impact?
Well, look, I don't think that anyone would argue that Germany's presence in the Security Council is more important than its role in the EU or NATO, and that's just a matter of political reality. For the time being, the notion of Germany getting a permanent seat on the Security Council remains as far away as ever. So, German engagement with the Council is by definition sporadic. What I would say about Germany's performance at the UN this year is that I think it's confirmed that Berlin's foreign policy view is broader than it might once have been. The fact that German diplomats have been very active on a series of African issues, and not only Sudan, is quite a big contrast to Berlin's last stint on the Security Council in 2011-2012, when Germany was seen as being pretty weak on Africa. The fact that Berlin is now really engaging quite substantively on African affairs, I think has sent a positive message about its growing engagement globally overall. I think that although a lot of German initiatives on international law have been declaratory, nonetheless, Berlin has used the Council term so far quite smartly to really communicate its commitment to a well-functioning rules-based world order. And that's an important piece of branding. I think that actually does affect the way that other countries view Germany's identity in the international sphere. So both on concrete issues relating to Africa and then more conceptual issues, I think that we're seeing Germany use the platform of the Security Council quite effectively to get across its foreign policy identity. And you do hear some other countries complain about German initiatives on some issues. I think that if we're honest, diplomats from a lot of countries friendly to Germany, like France and the UK, thought that the whole sexual violence resolution wasn't perfectly handled. But overall, conceptually, there's a lot of support for what Berlin is doing.
Thank you. There has one more question from Ben Christian from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. If you have to identify a topic that is not on the German Security Council agenda at the moment, but which should be on it for 2020, what would that be? And I think this is probably a very concrete topic that is mentioned here.
So, I think this is something that we touched on 5 minutes ago, but I do still think that there is an outside chance that the current peacemaking overtures between Kiev and Moscow will lead to some sort of compromise settlement for Donbass. And if you get a political deal over Ukraine, primarily between the Russians and Ukrainians, I think there is still a potential for the UN to have an important role, both in giving its blessing to that deal, but possibly also deploying monitors or peacekeepers to help secure the agreement. That's something that I have written about in the past, and my colleagues at the International Crisis Group are still working on. We don't know if a Ukrainian deal will come together in 2020, obviously, but I think that if a deal does come together, Germany and actually Estonia, which is coming onto the Security Council in January, will probably have quite a significant part to play in managing how the Security Council approaches the Ukrainian issue. So that's one possibility. One other issue which has been on the German agenda here, but I think is going to go up the German agenda, is Iran. And I think that we're talking about Sudan, we're talking about Ukraine, these are important, but the Iranian crisis could be one of the defining crises in the Security Council in 2020. The E3 are increasingly dissatisfied with Iran's breaches of the Iranian nuclear deal. There is a possibility that they might even start considering using the snapback mechanism to restore UN sanctions on Iran in 2020. The US, I think, may make a big push to try and restore UN sanctions on Iran next year in the run-up to the US elections. That would lead, I think, without doubt, to major tensions with the Russians and the Chinese. We don't know where all that will play out and where that will end up. But I think we can safely assume that Germany is going to be talking more about Iran and probably having to make some pretty difficult choices about how it triangulates between Washington and Tehran next year.
Yeah, thank you. Next year is also the year where we will celebrate, if there is something to celebrate, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Now, there are some efforts by member states, or I wouldn't even call it efforts at this point, but there are preparations to have a commemoration of that anniversary. As anniversaries go, they are normally commemorated in one way or another. Do you see that there is any effect of that anniversary for the working of the Council? I mean, let us not forget, for instance, we talked about nuclear disarmament. The first resolution that was passed, 46 in 1946, was about nuclear disarmament. So the issues back then when the UN was founded are still very valid, but not very much has been achieved, certainly with regards to nuclear disarmament. Do you feel there is anything in for the Council next year just because of the anniversary?
No. I think that there's going to be a bit of pageantry in the Security Council and in the UN system more generally, celebrating the 75th anniversary. And we know, for example, that as early as January, Vietnam, which holds the presidency of the Council at the start of the year, is going to hold a debate on the importance of the UN Charter. And I'm sure we'll see more declaratory diplomatic meetings of that type. But the reality is, and diplomats are very blunt about this behind the scenes, that while it would be nice to take some big steps to promote multilateralism in 2020, the politics of the situation are very bad. You have a US administration that is instinctively ill-disposed towards big multilateral gestures. I think that in all probability, the Trump administration will actually be looking for ways to weaken rather than strengthen the UN through next year, because on certain issues, such as sexual health, which we've talked about a lot, there's actually a domestic audience in the US that wants to see the UN undermined. China, we haven't talked very much about China in this interview, but China is becoming increasingly assertive in the UN system, and that's leading to lots of tensions, both with the US, but also with European powers. Difficulties with Russia persist. So I hope that we can collectively use the 75th anniversary to talk about the importance of the UN. I hope that it may be an opportunity to generate new ideas about multilateral cooperation that will take fruit down the road. But is 2020 going to be a great year for multilateral cooperation? I would not bet on that.
Well, that's a safe bet, but of course, we are always hoping for the better. And with that, I think, unless I see another question coming in here, but it doesn't seem to be the case, I would suggest that we thank very much Richard for his effort here with us today to give us the lay of the land, the halftime report on Germany, on the Security Council. I would all ask you to stay tuned for next year's Draht zum Rat renditions, when we will also try to tackle issues that are pending on the Council. And if you have ideas about what we should talk about, then please let us know. We are always, of course, open and very much interested what interests people in Germany to find out about the workings of the Council. And then last, but certainly not in the least, but very important, many of the things we have talked about will be coming out in the blog post that Richard wrote for us, and that will be published later this week on Germany's working on the Council the first year and the outlook for next year. So stay tuned, both on the Draht zum Rat and on our publications. And I thank you all for your attention today. Thank you to Richard once again, and I wish you all the very best for the end of the year, and see you again, talk to you again next year. Thank you.